All right. So I share a lot of macros with other people because they're very postmodern. They solve a problem and they throw away a lot of the window dressing with fancy application development. Like, we focus on solving the problem. But in order to implement the macros that I share, we have to understand we got to have some basic knowledge of how to implement them. The way we do that is through Revit. It's through the Manage tab of the ribbon bar. And over towards the right-hand side, we have a tool called the Macro Manager. And after a while, I make so many of these that I assign the Macro Manager to a keyboard shortcut. Here you can see on the drop-down that I've assigned it to 22. And if you're not familiar, I assign keyboard shortcuts by typing KS. That's the keyboard shortcut for keyboard shortcuts. I search for the Macro Manager, and I give it a keyboard shortcut down here of something that's very easy to type. I'm right-handed, so I'm using my mouse with my right hand, and my left hand is entering keystrokes on the keyboard. So I like double keystrokes that are on the left-hand side, 11QQ, AA, 2233, something that's very easy to accomplish. Okay. So I open my Macro Manager, and again, I use the icon up on the ribbon bar, or I use my keyboard shortcut. And the dialog box gives me two options for adding a macro to Revit. One, I can add it on the document level. So this is the default tab on the right-hand side. And what that does is it attaches the macro to the Revit model, meaning that anybody I share this model with is going to have access to the macro. However, based on the security settings in the options dialog box, other users are frequently going to be warned that the model contains a macro, because these can be developed to cause viruses. So I find the document level to be a little bit annoying if I'm the downstream recipient of somebody's models with macros. The alternative is assigning a macro to the application level, meaning that it's going to attach itself to Revit, in particular the version that I've got open. Here I'm working with 2021, sorry. And it's going to be available to me on my computer in any model that I open in 2021. And if I want to see it in a different release of Revit, I have to follow these steps to implement the macro on those versions or on other computers. Okay? So inside the application dialog, or the Macro Manager, under the Application tab, we've got all of the macros that I've previously set up. So to start off, on the right-hand side, I would like to create what they refer to as a module. I'm going to click on the Module button, and I'm going to create this as, you know, my macros. Something like that. I'm going to make sure the language is in C#, and I choose C# because this is the most common programming language used in the Autodesk SDK and used by the Autodesk Developers Network and their bloggers. So in other words, if I'm looking for a solution online, I'm most likely going to find it in C#. So I'm going to hit the OK button. This is going to give me access to copy and paste a lot of other people's work. Okay. When I create the module, it opens up a .NET development environment. And .NET is basically, you know, C# is a type of .NET programming language. .NET is an object-based sort of theory of programming. So think of BIM as being .NET and Revit as being C#. So C# is a .NET programming language. Revit is a BIM software, you know, design software. Okay, and the all of our macros are going to be created inside of this application class. So there's a lot of overheads in here that I'm not going to worry about right now. Instead, what I'm going to do is down here on line 32, you can see there's a section that's compressed called Revit Macro Generated Code. I'll put my cursor on the end of it, and I'm going to hit the Enter key on my keyboard a few times to give myself more space. I just hit it 3 times, and right now my cursor is on line 41. I'm going to go into the email, and typically what happens if you've worked with me is you've probably received an email. I'm going to go into my sent folder if I can find it, and maybe it looks something like this. where I would have cleared out everything inside of the email and just put a whole bunch of code. And maybe this looks like gibberish, but what I'm going to do is hit Control A on my keyboard to select all, Control C on my keyboard to copy that to the Windows clipboard, and inside of the code now on line 41, Control V, Victor, to paste. Okay. So as a sidebar, what we just pasted in here is in C# vocabulary, it's called a method. So a method is an action that one of my classes can perform. Okay. So it does things. And in the macro manager, they call these methods macros. So in other words, if I wanted to create a macro, if I clicked on this button, it would have basically created this public void and then the name of my macro. Okay, for now I'm going to put a pin in that. I want to compile this, so up on the ribbon bar of the Sharp Develop environment, there's a build menu. I'll click on build and choose build solution. And down at the bottom half of the screen, there should be a message that's related to error messages. We've got something like an unexpected character. So the beauty of the macro, the Sharp Develop environment, is that these error messages are hyperlinks. I can basically click on it and it'll take me right to the place in the code where the problem is. And you'll notice one thing that happens, a funny thing is when I copy and paste these macros through an email, for some reason Outlook, Microsoft, strips quotation marks off of the code. So here where I've got log copy parameters, this was supposed to be a text string encapsulated by quotation marks. So what I did was I put a quotation mark before the // and a quotation mark after the txt. What I'm doing here is I'm essentially creating a like a log file on my desktop that I can use to review how the macro performed its task, and if it failed, I can find the element it failed at. So typically these macros are iterating through a large number of families inside of my Revit model, and sometimes it's the 534th thing that failed. So I can't simply use a debugger to go through the code line by line. I would rather just have a log file like a txt or a CSV. Okay. Now there's another warning message down here. So at the bottom, you can see the Sharp Develop. It didn't resolve the issue in real time, but once I debug this, that's going to go away. I'm going to click on the second line of code, and what's interesting is the second error took me back to the same line. So maybe I resolved both errors at the same time. And to find out, I'm going to go to the build menu again, build solution, and now that error message goes away, but I get a lot more error messages. And this time they're related to a class that I'm using, something called the Stream Writer. And the Stream Writer is a class or an object or a tool that comes from the Windows API. And what I need to do is at the very beginning, the top of the code, I have to tell my macro that we want to reference the Windows API. So these APIs are just DLL files floating on my computer somewhere, and just like in design, when I'm setting up my model, I have to X-reference in an architectural background or link in an architectural model. It's the same theory. These lines of code up here at the top, lines 9 through 14, are basically my link manager in Revit or my XREF manager in AutoCAD. So to add another reference, I'm just going to hit enter, give myself another line on line 15, and I'm going to follow suit with everything. Like I'm just going to redo what was already here. So it seems to me that the word using with a lowercase u is the indicator that I want to reference an API. Anything that comes from the Windows API is going to come from the system. So I'm just going to type in system, and I'm going to type a period here, and IntelliSense is going to give me access to all of the, let's call these folders that are inside of the Windows System API. The technical term is namespace, but in principle it's just a partition or a bucket in which all of the classes, including the Stream Writer that I'm missing, are going to be found. and one of them is called I/O. So I can either type in capital I/O, I could select it from the list, and then I'm going to type a semicolon at the end of that line of code. So I just want to create a reference to the Windows system I/O for input output. I go to build, I build the solution, and now I've got no warning messages. I'm going to minimize this. I'll keep it open on my Windows taskbar, and when I go back into the macro manager, you can see that the My Macro now is expandable because it has macros. And in this example, I created code that's going to copy a service. The idea is that it's going to iterate through all of the pipe accessories in my model, it's going to find attached fabrication parts, and it's going to copy the service name from the fabrication parts into the comments of the pipe accessory. So what I can do is I can just select it, click on the Run button on the upper right hand corner, and then to verify it worked, here's a fabrication pipework attached to a pipe accessory, and you can see here that it copied the STN cold water. What did we actually copy in? Are we not attached? No, we're not. Okay. Let's come back and make sure that we're attached. Or, rather than fiddle around with this, I could always find something that is attached. So here, in the comments, it now says potable water, which should match the fabrication service. And we'll just double check that worked. If I were to delete that, and now to run the macro again, remember I assigned the macro manager to my keyboard shortcut 22. Type 22. The macro manager is going to remember the last macro you ran, so I can just click on Run again. And that updated the comments in my pipe accessory. So here's an example of the macro working. At the same time, it created a log file on my desktop. And if I were to go back in the macro, you remember that StreamWriter line. What we were actually doing was we were creating a folder path to each user's desktop, and on the desktop we were creating a file called log copy parameters. So if I go into my desktop and I've got a log copy parameters txt file, this is now a log. In this particular macro, I'm logging every mechanical equipment that I found in the view, every plumbing fixture that I found in the view, and every pipe accessory. So if there were an error and I wanted to find out if there was a problem, I could always copy the element ID, and back inside of my code, I might be able to select by ID, paste it in, and then where the heck is it? There it is. So that's the element ID, and once again we're attached to potable water. Oh no, sorry, this one's not attached, so I wouldn't have expected anything to work. This hadn't been converted into fabrication parts yet. Okay. Now in any case, I'm getting into the weeds of a specific macro that I might have provided, but the steps that I mentioned earlier for copying, pasting, creating a new macro, debugging it, building it, fixing errors, those are going to be true on any macro that I provide. So in any case, good luck, and I hope this helps.